The phone rang at 2:17, slicing through the quiet like a blade. Peter didn't answer it at first. He never did. Numbers that arrived in the middle of the night carried a weight he'd learned to recognize, one that pressed on the chest before a single word was spoken. He let it ring, staring at the ceiling of the barracks, counting the seconds between vibrations, pretending that if he ignored it long enough, the call would lose its meaning. It didn't. The phone stopped. Silence rushed back in, thicker than before. Then it rang again. No one calls twice unless it matters. Peter swung his legs over the edge of the bed, every muscle already tight, already braced. He answered on the second ring. Peter Hale. There was a pause, too long, too careful. Static breathed on the line. "This is Captain Morris," the voice said. "Calm. Controlled. Trained. Are you somewhere you can sit down?" Peter laughed once, sharply. "I'm sitting." Another pause. He hated the pauses most. They were where hope went to die. "I'm calling about Sergeant James Cole." The room tilted, just slightly. Peter pressed his palm into the mattress, grounding himself. "Yeah," he said. "What about him?" The captain exhaled. Peter heard it, heard everything. The shift in tone. The softening. The quiet resignation of a man who had made too many of these calls. "There was an incident during a night patrol," Morris said. "An IED. James was hit." Peter closed his eyes. "Where is he?" The words came out automatic, professional, like they'd rehearsed this moment without meaning to. "What hospital?" Another silence. This one was different. Final. "I'm sorry," the captain said. "He didn't make it." The world didn't shatter. It didn't explode or collapse. It simply stopped. As if someone had reached inside Peter and turned everything off. He waited for the pain. For the grief. For the scream that should have torn out of his chest. Nothing came. "I need you to repeat that," Peter said quietly. The captain did. Slower this time. Clearer. "James Cole. Killed in action. Time of death 1:43. Peter nodded even though no one could see him. Training kicked in. Muscle memory. He asked the right questions. Took down details he already knew wouldn't matter. The call ended the way these calls always did, with sympathy, protocol, and a promise of paperwork. When the line went dead, Peter stared at the phone in his hand. James was gone. James, who had shared his rations without asking. James, who laughed too loud and lived too fast. James, who had talked about his sister like she was the center of the universe, like everything good in his life traced back to her. James, who had once clapped Peter on the shoulder and said, "If anything ever happens to me, promise me you'll take care of them." Peter had scoffed. Told him to shut up. Told him they'd both make it home. The phone vibrated again. Peter froze. For a wild, impossible second, he thought, "This is it. This is the correction. This is the call that says they were wrong." He answered without looking. "Yes." This time, there was no voice. Just a notification. One new message. From James. Peter's breath caught. His thumb hovered, trembling, as if the phone itself might burn him. The message had been sent hours earlier. Scheduled. Deliberate. He opened it. "If you're reading this, then you already know." The words blurred. Peter swallowed hard, the first real crack splitting through the numbness. His chest tightened, sharp and sudden, like he'd forgotten how to breathe and his body was just now reminding him. You made it. I didn't. No, Peter whispered, the word breaking apart in the air. No, no. Don't do the guilt thing. I know you. I know how your mind works. If there was any way you could have saved me, you would have. Peter pressed the phone to his forehead, eyes squeezed shut. I need one thing from you. His pulse thundered. Get out of the army. Go to Telluride. The room felt smaller. Closer. Like the walls were leaning in. Ella's raising the twins alone. She won't ask for help. She never does. But she's lost everyone now. Grandma. Our parents. And me. A sound escaped Peter, half breath, half fracture. There's something else you don't know. Something that's tearing her family apart. She's going to need you more than she'll ever admit. Peter's vision swam. If I'm gone, I can't be there for her. I can't help them through this. The words slowed him, anchored him. But you can. Peter's jaw tightened. His hands shook. I'm begging you. As my best friend. Take care of my sister. Take care of my family. The last line waited for him. Heavy. Final. Please don't make her go through it alone. James. The phone slipped from Peter's hands and hit the floor with a dull thud. He stared at the wall, chest heaving now, breath uneven, grief finally breaking through the numbness like a dam giving way. He hadn't cried yet. He didn't know if he would. But something inside him had shifted, realigned around a single, immovable truth. James was gone. And Peter had been left behind, with a promise he didn't know how to keep. A town he'd never wanted to return to, and a woman he was already certain would change everything. Some calls change your night. This one changed the rest of his life. A funeral without closure. The sky was too blue for a day like this. It stretched endlessly above the cemetery, clear and indifferent, as if the world had decided to move on without asking permission. Peter stood at the edge of the crowd, hands buried deep in the pockets of his coat, boots sinking slightly into the damp earth. The smell of pine and cold soil clung to the air, sharp and grounding, yet nothing about this moment felt real. Coffins weren't supposed to be this quiet. There should have been shouting. Rage. Someone demanding answers from the sky. But instead, there was only the low murmur of polite condolences and the soft rustle of black fabric in the wind. James deserved more than this neat, controlled farewell. He deserved noise. He deserved fury. Peter stared at the polished wood, unable to reconcile it with the man who had once laughed too loud, lived too hard, and believed, foolishly, that everyone made it home eventually. His chest tightened. He had survived explosions, gunfire, nights where sleep never came, but this. This was the moment that broke him. Because there was no enemy to fight here. No mission to complete. Just absence. And guilt. It wrapped around him like a second skin. He should have been there. Should have noticed something. Should have pushed harder, argued longer, refused to let James take that assignment alone. The what ifs stacked endlessly in his mind, each one heavier than the last. You made it. I didn't. The words echoed again, uninvited. Peter squeezed his jaw shut, refusing to let the memory surface here, not now. He wasn't ready for the letter. Not yet. He still needed to believe, just for a few more minutes, that James might walk up behind him and crack a joke about the turnout. But the casket didn't move. The priest spoke of sacrifice, of honor, of service. The words floated past Peter without landing. They were too clean, too rehearsed. They sanded down the truth until it fit neatly into a speech. James's life had never been neat. A woman's quiet sob broke through the stillness. Peter turned slightly and saw her. Ella. She stood rigid, hands clenched in front of her, eyes fixed on the ground as though looking up might shatter whatever was holding her together. She didn't cry the way people expected grief to look. No wailing, no collapse. Just stillness, terrifying in its restraint. Two small figures flanked her, twins, no more than 5 or 6. They wore matching coats too big for their thin shoulders, fingers laced together like anchors. One leaned into Ella's leg. The other stared at the casket with a confusion that hurt to witness. They didn't understand yet. Peter swallowed hard. This was the part James hadn't been able to protect them from. When it was time to lower the casket, something inside Peter snapped. The finality of it, the way the ropes tightened and the wood disappeared inch by inch into the earth, it felt like watching a door close that would never open again. He wanted to scream for them to stop. Instead, he stood frozen, every muscle locked, as soil struck wood with a dull, unforgiving thud. That sound followed him long after the service ended. People approached him with careful expressions, offering words that meant well but landed hollow. He was a hero. He died doing what he loved. At least he didn't suffer. Peter nodded. Thanked them. Played the role expected of him. None of them knew the truth. As the crowd thinned, he noticed Ella still standing there, unmoving. The twins had wandered a few steps away, distracted by something unseen, but she remained rooted to the spot, eyes finally lifted to the grave. Peter hesitated before approaching. "I'm sorry," he said quietly, hating how small the words sounded. Ella looked at him then, really looked, and for a moment, something raw flickered across her face. Recognition. Pain. Maybe even blame. But it vanished just as quickly, replaced by a polite, practiced composure. "He talked about you," she said. "All the time." Peter nodded, throat too tight to answer. "He trusted you," she added, and that, more than anything, felt like a weight he wasn't sure he could carry. As he walked away, the letter burned against his chest where he had tucked it safely inside his coat. He didn't need to open it to know one thing was already true. This funeral hadn't given him peace. It had given him a promise to keep. And a life he could no longer avoid stepping into. Words written for the living. The letter waited on the kitchen counter like it had weight, like it could tip the room off its balance if anyone touched it. Peter stood across from it for a long moment, boots still on, coat half unzipped, the cold of the mountains clinging to him. The house was quiet in the way only grieving houses were, too still, too aware of what had been lost. Somewhere down the hall, a floorboard creaked as the heating system adjusted, and for a split second, he almost believed someone was walking toward him. He knew better. James's handwriting stared back at him, unmistakable. Slight slant to the right. Firm strokes. Confident. Alive. Peter had survived explosions, gunfire, nights where the air itself felt hostile. None of that had prepared him for the simple brutality of ink on paper. Saturday. The chair scraped softly against the floor, loud in the silence. His hands hovered over the envelope, fingers trembling despite every instinct he had trained into them. Control. Precision. Readiness. This required none of that. This required surrender. He broke the seal. The paper inside was folded once, cleanly. James had always been like that, orderly, even when life wasn't. Peter. The room seemed to narrow around him. If you're reading this, well, you know the last letter drill. You made it. I didn't. His chest tightened, breath catching before he could stop it. He read on, because stopping felt worse. Get off the guilt train, because I know if there was any chance you could have saved me, you would have. Peter closed his eyes. Guilt was the one thing he hadn't managed to leave behind. It lived in him now, settled deep, heavy and familiar. I need one thing from you. Get out of the army and get to Telluride. The words landed like an order and a plea all at once. My little sister is raising the twins alone. She won't ask for help. She never does. But she's lost everyone, our grandmother, our parents, and now me. It's too much for one person. It's not fair. Peter swallowed hard. He pictured her the way he remembered, chin lifted, shoulders squared, eyes daring the world to test her. Strength had always been her armor. He wondered how heavy it had become. There's something else you don't know. Something that's tearing her family apart. I can't write it here. Not like this. But she's going to need help. The paper trembled in Peter's hands. If I'm gone, I can't be there for her. I can't help them through it. But you can. So I'm asking you, as my best friend, take care of my sister. Take care of my family. Peter's vision blurred, the words bleeding into one another. Please don't let her do this alone. The letter ended there. No grand goodbye. No poetry. Just a name. James. Peter stared at the page long after the words had been absorbed, as though something else might appear if he waited long enough. Instructions. Answers. Permission to refuse. None came. He folded the letter carefully, returning it to the envelope as if that might preserve the sound of James's voice inside it. His chest ached with the weight of what had been handed to him, not a request, not really, but a continuation of a friendship that had never allowed half measures. Words written for the living, Peter realized. Not to say goodbye, but to demand something harder. To stay. To show up. To choose life, even when death had already taken so much. Outside, snow began to fall, quiet, relentless, covering the ground in white, as if trying to soften the edges of the world. Peter stood, the letter tucked close to his chest, and understood with painful clarity that his life had just been redirected. And that there would be no turning back. The promise I shouldn't have made. The letter felt heavier than paper had any right to feel. I sat alone on the edge of my bunk, the barracks quiet in that uneasy way that came after bad news, when everyone pretended to sleep, but no one really did. James's handwriting stared back at me, sharp and familiar, like he'd written it yesterday instead of weeks ago. Like he might walk in at any moment and tell me this was all some cruel joke. If you're reading this, you made it. I didn't. My jaw tightened. I read the words again, slower this time, as if pacing myself might dull the impact. It didn't. The guilt hit anyway, fast and merciless, curling in my chest, tightening my throat. I pressed my thumb against the fold of the paper, grounding myself in the small, stupid details, the crease, the ink, the way his eyes always leaned too far to the right. Get off the guilt train, he'd written. I almost laughed at that. Almost. The letter didn't ask much. That was the thing that broke me. After everything, after the years, the tours, the promises we'd made to each other about coming home, it asked for one thing. Get out of the army. Go to Telluride. Take care of my sister. I closed my eyes and saw Ella the way she'd looked the last time I'd seen her, chin lifted, shoulders squared, grief already etched too deep for someone so young. James had always worried about her, said she carried the world like it was hers alone to hold. Independent, stubborn, fierce. He'd loved her for that. He'd feared it too. The twins need her, he'd written. And she needs you, even if she won't say it. I stared at the wall across from me, its paint chipped and scarred, and thought about all the promises I'd ever made. Most of them had been easy at the time. Words spoken in moments of certainty, backed by the illusion that there would always be time to make good on them. This one was different. This one demanded my life in exchange. Leaving the army wasn't just a decision, it was an identity stripped bare. It was walking away from the one place where loss had rules, where grief came with structure, and salutes and folded flags. It meant stepping into a world where James would never exist again except in memory, where his absence wouldn't be shared or explained. And it meant Ella. Ella with her grief and her guarded eyes. Ella, who would look at me and see everything she'd lost. Or worse, everything she couldn't afford to lose again. I unfolded the letter one last time, my gaze catching on the final lines. Please don't make her go through it alone. I felt something settle then, heavy and final, like a door closing behind me. I could have said no. I could have folded the letter away, told myself that grief made men ask for impossible things. Instead, I whispered the promise into the empty room. I'll go. The words tasted like surrender. In that moment, I didn't think about what it would cost me. I didn't think about how promises made to the dead don't come with escape clauses. I only thought about the man who had saved my life more times than I could count, and the sister he was trusting me with now. It was the promise I shouldn't have made. And the one that would change everything. The duffel bag lay open on the bed, half packed, like it was waiting for him to change his mind. Peter stood in the doorway of his barracks room, boots still on, helmet under his arm, staring at the few things he owned that weren't issued by the army. A spare jacket. A worn paperback with its spine broken from rereading. A photograph he hadn't meant to keep. James's grin was frozen in time, sunburned and reckless, arms slung around Peter's shoulder, as if the world had never asked them for anything more than laughter. Peter turned the photo face down. Leaving should have felt like relief. He had imagined it that way for years, walking away from the noise, the commands, the weight of always being ready for something terrible. But now that the paperwork was signed and the final briefing was over, all he felt was a hollow pressure in his chest, as if something essential had already been taken from him, and he was about to give up the rest willingly. The army had been simple. Not easy, never that, but simple. Orders. Purpose. Brotherhood forged by shared fear and shared silence. Out there, in Telluride, nothing would tell him who to be. No uniform. No rank. No distance between him and the consequences of staying alive when someone else hadn't. He zipped the bag closed harder than necessary. Outside, the late afternoon sun hung low, staining the horizon amber. The bass was louder than usual, engines, shouted jokes, boots on concrete, but it all blurred together, like a life he was already forgetting. A few men clapped him on the shoulder as he passed, offered half-smiles and good lucks that didn't ask questions. They didn't need explanations. Everyone left eventually. Some just left differently. At the gate, Peter stopped. For a moment, he considered turning back. Staying. Pretending the letter had never arrived. Pretending promises made in grief didn't count. But the words were carved into him now. Please don't make her go through it alone. He stepped through the gate and didn't look back. The drive stretched long and quiet, mile after mile of road unspooling beneath his tires. He let the radio play without listening, his thoughts drifting where he didn't want them. He remembered James talking about home, the way his voice softened when he mentioned the mountains, the way he carried pictures of the twins like proof of something good waiting beyond the next deployment. Ella had always been an abstract thing to Peter. A name. A responsibility mentioned in passing. He had never imagined her face, never imagined the sound of her voice, never imagined the weight of her grief settling into his own life. By the time the landscape began to rise and the air grew thinner, night had fallen. Snow dusted the roadside, catching the headlights in brief flashes of white. The mountains loomed ahead, dark and immovable, and something inside him tightened. This place didn't feel like a destination. It felt like a reckoning. He pulled into the small town just past midnight. Most of the windows were dark, the streets hushed under a blanket of cold. Telluride slept the way only mountain towns did, deeply, as if it trusted the world to leave it alone. Peter parked in front of the house James had once described in too much detail. Blue door. Slanted porch. Wind chimes that never shut up. The porch light was off. He sat in the car longer than necessary, hands gripping the steering wheel, heart pounding like he was about to walk into enemy fire. This was the moment he couldn't undo. Once he stepped out, the life he knew, the one with clear lines and controlled distances, would be gone. He opened the door. The cold bit immediately, sharp and unforgiving. Peter slung the bag over his shoulder and climbed the steps. The house was silent, dark except for a faint glow from somewhere inside. He raised his hand to knock, then hesitated. James should have been the one standing here. James should have been the one climbing these steps, laughing about how ridiculous it was to miss home this much. Peter knocked anyway. The sound echoed louder than it should have. Footsteps approached. A pause. Then the door opened just enough for a woman's face to appear in the dim light. She looked exhausted. Not the dramatic kind of exhaustion that announced itself loudly, but the quiet kind that lived behind the eyes and pulled the shoulders inward. Her hair was pulled back carelessly, strands escaping around her face. She wore an oversized sweater, sleeves pushed up, as if she'd forgotten they were there. For a moment, she just stared at him. Yes, she asked, her voice cautious, already braced for something she didn't want. Peter swallowed. I'm Peter. Her breath caught. The door opened wider. The light spilled onto the porch, revealing eyes too bright with unshed tears and a face that looked painfully like James's, same jaw, same stubborn line to the mouth. I'm sorry, he said, because it was the only thing he knew how to say. I should have called. I promised him I'd come. She nodded once, as if her body had made the decision before her heart could object. You're late, she said quietly, stepping aside. Peter crossed the threshold. The door closed behind him with a soft, final sound, and just like that, the only life he knew was gone. The long road to Telluride. The hum of the engine was almost hypnotic, a steady rhythm against the chaos in Peter's mind. Snowflakes whipped against the windshield, little shards of winter that blurred the world outside. He gripped the steering wheel a little tighter, forcing himself to focus on the road. Each mile brought him closer to Telluride, but also closer to the grief he wasn't sure he was ready to face. James's letter rested on the passenger seat, its edges dog-eared and smudged from repeated reading. Peter's thumb traced the folds absently, the words burning themselves into his mind, please don't make her go through it alone. He had promised, but a heavy weight pressed on his chest. Could he really walk into a house full of ghosts and take care of someone else's family when he was barely holding himself together? The mountains rose in the distance, dark and imposing against the grey sky. They seemed to mirror the storm inside him, the impossible peaks of guilt, the valleys of sorrow, the sharp edges of longing. Peter swallowed hard. James had trusted him with everything, the twins, Ella, the remnants of a family ripped apart too soon. A sharp gust of wind rattled the car, and he flinched. He imagined Ella waiting for him, standing stiffly in the doorway, trying to be strong, trying to hold it all together. She was stubborn, he remembered. Fiercely independent. And she had already endured too much. Losing James, losing their parents, losing their grandmother, it wasn't fair. No one could endure that and remain untouched. The road twisted, and Peter tightened his grip on the wheel, silently talking himself through the miles. One step at a time. One house. One heartbeat at a time. He could do this. He had to. The first glimpse of Telluride's snow-dusted rooftops made his chest tighten. Small, quaint, and painfully beautiful, the town seemed frozen in a moment he wasn't sure he wanted to enter. Yet, he knew that behind one of those doors, Ella waited, burdened by grief and secret struggles he didn't yet understand. He exhaled, letting the car slow as he neared the town. For the first time since reading James's letter, Peter allowed himself a flicker of determination. He had made a promise. And sometimes, keeping a promise meant walking straight into the pain you feared most. He parked the car in front of the small, weathered house, snow crunching under his boots as he stepped out. The wind bit at his cheeks, and he adjusted the scarf around his neck, forcing himself to breathe. Each step toward the door was heavier than the last, yet necessary. Because grief alone was too much for anyone to bear. And Peter was ready to prove that love, alive, human love, could still stand in the face of loss. He raised his hand to knock. The door swung open before he could even touch it. Ella stood there, framed by the dim light of the entryway, her eyes wide, guarded, but undeniably alive. "Peter," she said, voice tight. "I wasn't expecting you this soon." "I promised James," he said simply, the words carrying more weight than he had anticipated. "I'm here." Her lips pressed into a thin line, a mixture of relief, sorrow, and disbelief. And in that moment, Peter realized this was just the beginning of healing, of heartbreak, and, possibly, of a love neither of them knew they were allowed to have. Peter pushed open the creaking front door and froze. The house smelled of old pine and dust, with faint traces of vanilla, Ella's signature candle scent. Every step he took echoed through the empty halls, bouncing off walls that had once been filled with laughter, now silent, but heavy with absence. Photos hung crookedly on the walls, James smiling in front of a campfire, their parents holding Ella as a baby, Ella herself with the twins barely a year old. Peter felt the weight of all those faces stare at him, accusing him, reminding him of promises he hadn't yet fulfilled. The living room was the hardest. James's favorite armchair sat untouched, a thin layer of dust collecting in the seat's indentation, where he had spent evenings reading or arguing about music. Peter sank into it briefly, and it felt like sitting in a memory that refused to let him breathe. The silence pressed on him, 1,000 invisible ghosts filling the space with whispers of what once was. From the kitchen came the faint sound of little feet. Peter turned. The twins peeked around the corner, wide-eyed and cautious. "Hi," he said, his voice rough, unsure. They hesitated, then bolted to Ella's side, as if his presence alone threatened the fragile order of their home. Ella appeared behind them, her posture tight, shoulders squared. She was wearing the same worn sweater Peter remembered from summers long past, her hair pulled back in a careless bun. Her eyes were dark pools of exhaustion and grief, and for a moment, Peter thought he might crumble under their weight. "Peter," she said quietly, but her voice carried the steel of someone who had fought battles alone for too long. You didn't have to come. I promised James, Peter said, his throat tight. And I intend to keep it. Ella's lips pressed into a thin line. Then you should know, it's worse than you think. This house, it's full of ghosts. Not the kind you see. The kind that stay after everyone else has left. Peter nodded, understanding more than she realized. Ghosts weren't just memories, they were regrets, unspoken words, and the echoes of those who had shaped your life and left too soon. And he had come here to face them all, whether he was ready or not. A loud crash came from upstairs, and the twins squealed. Peter and Ella exchanged a glance that spoke volumes. The house wasn't just haunted by memories, it was alive with the chaos of life trying to move forward despite grief. Peter exhaled slowly, bracing himself. Ghosts or not, he was here now. And if James's last wish meant anything, he wasn't leaving without staying, without helping Ella, and without learning how to love the family James had left behind. He took a step toward her, toward the twins, toward the house full of ghosts, and for the first time, he allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, they could all find a way to live again. Ella's hands were full before Peter even stepped through the doorway. Laundry baskets teetered in one arm, the twins clinging to her legs with sticky little hands, and a half-empty grocery bag dangled precariously from her shoulder. She didn't notice him at first, too focused on keeping everything from tumbling down in a heap. "I've got it," she said before he could even offer. Her voice was sharp, defensive, but underneath it there was exhaustion that didn't quite match the firmness of her tone. "Really? You don't need to." "Ella," Peter interrupted gently, setting the duffel bag he'd brought down with him on the floor. "I'm here. I'm not asking. I'm staying. That's all." Her jaw tightened. She had rehearsed this exact conversation in her head countless times. She didn't need anyone's pity, or sympathy, or whatever this was. The last thing she wanted was someone telling her how to raise her family or fix the mess that life had left her in. She had survived this long on her own. She could survive a little longer. "I don't need you to stay," she said, trying to sound casual, though her hands trembled ever so slightly. "I know what I'm doing. I always do." Peter watched her, taking in the stubborn line of her shoulders, the weariness in her eyes, the way she tried so hard to appear in control. He didn't respond immediately. Instead, he knelt down to greet the twins, who immediately clamored for attention, dragging him into their little world without resistance. He let them, smiling softly, because he knew Ella was watching. She needed to see him, not just as a soldier, or a best friend, or the man who had promised James, but as someone who refused to leave. "You're not alone," he said finally, his voice low but steady, meant only for her ears. "Not anymore." Ella's lips pressed together. She wanted to snap at him, to tell him that she could handle this without interference. But the words wouldn't come. The truth, the raw, gnawing truth, settled over her like winter frost. She wasn't handling it alone. Not really. She had been pretending for too long. And maybe she didn't have to anymore. Still, she turned away, busying herself with the chaos of her home. She wouldn't let him see the crack forming in her armor. Not yet. But Peter didn't move. He didn't leave. He simply stood there, silently, letting the weight of his presence fill the room. And for the first time in months, Ella felt a flicker of relief she wasn't ready to name. Relief. And something dangerously close to hope. Peter stepped onto the porch, the wind biting at his cheeks, carrying the scent of pine and fresh snow. The house felt impossibly quiet, each creak of the floorboards echoing through the empty rooms like a memory that refused to fade. Ella moved through the kitchen, her hands busy with breakfast, but her eyes, those sharp, unyielding eyes, caught his before she could look away. The twins were at the table, small and stubborn, arguing over which spoon was theirs. Peter felt a familiar pang in his chest. The sound of their laughter, half squabble and half joy, wrapped around him like a tether he hadn't realized he needed. 2 small reasons to stay, he thought bitterly, shaking his head at how easy it was for them to anchor him when nothing else could. Ella glanced at him again, a fleeting softness passing over her face before she masked it with a frown. She didn't need his pity. She didn't need his help. But the children did, and in the way only a family could, they needed him too. He poured himself a cup of coffee, the warmth seeping into his cold fingers, and watched as the twins argued over a puzzle piece that neither wanted to give up. Peter crouched beside them, careful not to startle. "Hey, how about we make it a team effort?" Their heads turned toward him, skepticism written in the furrow of their brows, and then slowly, reluctantly, smiles broke across their faces. One of them, Ella's son, reached out, handing him a piece. Peter took it, and for the first time since reading James's letter, he felt like he had a place in this house, in this grief, in this fragile, fractured family. He looked at Ella, who was pretending to be busy, but whose gaze lingered on him far longer than she realized. 2 small reasons to stay. The twins, yes, but maybe, just maybe, her too. The thought made his chest tighten. The wind outside could howl and shake the windows all it wanted. Inside, amidst spilled cereal, scattered puzzle pieces, and quiet, stubborn love, Peter realized he had already started choosing to stay. The kitchen smelled faintly of burnt toast and coffee, a scent that felt both ordinary and achingly familiar. Peter stood by the counter, staring at the stove as if it might suddenly offer answers he wasn't ready to hear. Ella moved around the table with her usual efficiency, placing plates and cutlery with careful precision, her hands steady while her eyes betrayed a quiet exhaustion. Peter's gaze fell on the empty chair at the head of the table. The chair James had always claimed as his own, insisting it was his command post for family dinners, even when he teased about being the boss of everyone. Now it sat there, stark and accusing, a silent reminder that the person who had anchored their world was gone. Ella caught his eyes lingering and smiled faintly, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Don't stare at it," she said softly, her voice carrying a mixture of fatigue and gentle reproach. "It's just a chair." "It's not just a chair," Peter said, his voice quieter than he intended. He stepped closer and ran a hand over the polished wood. It felt cold, unyielding. "It's him." Ella's hands paused mid-motion, as she set a plate down. "He's not coming back," she said, more firmly this time. "And staring at the chair won't change that." Peter swallowed the lump forming in his throat. He wanted to argue, to tell her that he could change things, that he could somehow fill the void James had left. But he knew the truth, he was alive, and James wasn't, and no amount of presence could replace that absence. "So what do we do?" he asked finally, softer now, almost a whisper. Ella sighed, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. "We eat. We keep moving forward. We live like he would have wanted us to." Peter nodded, though his eyes kept darting to the empty chair. It felt impossible to move on, impossible to ignore the space that had once been filled with James's laughter, his teasing, the quiet way he somehow made everyone feel seen. When they both sat down, the silence was heavy but not suffocating. The twins chatted between bites, oblivious to the emptiness at the head of the table, and for a moment, Peter allowed himself to imagine James's grin, hear his voice mocking him for being so somber, for taking grief too seriously. "You know," Ella said, finally breaking the quiet, "he'd hate that we're sitting here staring at the chair like it's sacred." Peter smiled despite himself, a small, fragile thing. "Yeah?" He'd probably tell us to eat before it gets cold. Ella chuckled softly, and for the first time since he'd arrived, Peter felt a flicker of warmth in the room. The empty chair still loomed, still reminded him of all that was lost, but in that moment, it didn't feel quite so heavy. They were here, together, and somehow, even in absence, James's presence lingered, not in the chair, but in the quiet love that held them all at the table. And for the first time that morning, Peter felt a tentative hope that maybe, just maybe, they could find a way forward. Peter stepped into the kitchen, the cold morning light slicing through the windows, painting Ella's tired face in soft gold. She was at the counter, cradling a mug that seemed too big for her hands, the twins asleep upstairs. For a moment, he thought she might vanish if he looked away, like a mirage built from grief and stubbornness. "I made coffee," she said, her voice flat, but her eyes flickered, just for a second, toward the mugs he had brought. No thanks, no smile, nothing that suggested warmth. Yet it was enough. He leaned against the doorframe, hands stuffed into his jacket pockets, pretending that the ache in his chest wasn't from seeing her this way. She was holding the weight of the world in her shoulders, and no words, not even his, could lift it. He started, then stopped. The words felt clumsy, inadequate. What do you say to someone who's lost everything? Ella didn't ask him to speak. She never did. She just stared at the steam rising from her mug, her eyes distant, focused on something he couldn't see. The silence stretched between them, heavy and unyielding, but not uncomfortable. It was the first time since he arrived that he didn't feel like an intruder in her grief. He moved closer, quietly, letting his presence fill the space rather than trying to fill it with words. She flinched at the faintest sound of his boots on the tile, but didn't step back. For the first time, he noticed the small things, the way her hands trembled slightly as she held the mug, how her hair fell in loose strands around her face, the soft, rhythmic rise and fall of her shoulders. No one had ever been allowed this close. No one since James. "I'm here," he whispered finally, almost afraid that saying it too loudly might shatter the fragile truce of silence. She didn't respond, but she didn't walk away either. She let him stand there, the quiet stretching like a bridge between their sorrow and something unspoken, something fragile that might one day grow. The twins stirred upstairs, their small cries pulling at her attention, and she set her mug down. Peter followed her gaze, noting the fleeting twitch of her lips, an almost smile she probably didn't realize she had made. They moved together through the kitchen, through the house, in silence. No words were needed, they were learning the language of presence, of shared grief, of a love that didn't need to be named yet. In that silence, Peter realized something profound. Sometimes, being there, simply standing in the space someone needs, spoke louder than any words ever could. And for the first time since he had arrived in Telluride, he felt like he belonged. The sunlight slanted through the kitchen window in golden streaks, dust motes dancing in its warmth, but inside the house, the light did little to lift the weight of silence. Peter moved mechanically, pouring coffee into 2 mugs, one for him, one for Ella. She didn't look up from her plate of toast, and he didn't ask her to. He watched her for a moment, memorizing the slump of her shoulders, the way her hands trembled slightly as she buttered her bread. He remembered James's words in the letter, the way they had made his chest ache, "Please don't make her go through it alone." They had shared a home now for nearly a week, but the gap between them felt as wide as the canyon behind the house. She spoke in clipped sentences, polite but distant, as though every word might carry the risk of unraveling everything. Peter had tried to start conversations, small ones, meaningless ones, about groceries, about the weather, about the twins, but she always responded with nods or monosyllables. Still, there was comfort in this quiet. He would sit across from her, sip his coffee, and watch her move through the motions. She was grieving, yes, but she was alive. And that mattered. The twins stirred upstairs, their laughter faint but familiar, a reminder of the life that persisted despite the losses surrounding them. Ella's gaze softened for a fraction of a second when she heard it, a glimpse of the warmth she kept locked away. Peter smiled faintly to himself. He cleared his throat. I made eggs. Do you want some? Ella shook her head, not meeting his eyes. Not hungry. He didn't press. He sat back, letting the quiet stretch between them. Shared mornings didn't need conversation, shared presence was enough. And in that presence, Peter made a silent vow, he would bear some of her grief, even if she refused to let him in. He would be the anchor she didn't yet realize she needed. The sun climbed higher, bathing the kitchen in warmth that felt almost like hope. For now, it was enough. The twins' laughter echoed again, brighter this time, and Peter allowed himself a small, private smile. They would find their way, slowly, together. Even if the sorrows were still separate, they were no longer completely alone. The kitchen smelled faintly of burnt toast and cold coffee, a reminder that Ella had tried to keep mornings normal for the twins, even when mornings themselves had lost their meaning. Peter leaned against the doorway, watching her move through the room with that same determined grace she always had, even when her eyes carried storms he didn't dare name aloud. He wanted to say something, anything, but every word he considered seemed inadequate. Nothing could fill the hollow space left by James, and yet here he was, standing in that emptiness, feeling like a trespasser in a grief that wasn't entirely his own. A soft giggle cut through the silence. One of the twins had spotted him. The little girl toddled forward, holding a mismatched sock like a trophy. Ella's stern "be careful" barely reached his ears, drowned out by the smile he hadn't realized he was holding back. He knelt, arms outstretched, and the child ran into them without hesitation. Don't let him fool you, Ella said quietly from the counter, not turning. He doesn't do mornings. Peter grinned anyway. I make exceptions. Her glance flickered at him, sharp and measured, and then it softened, just a fraction. He caught it and held it in his chest like a small victory. It wasn't much, but it was enough to remind him that the gaps in her life, the holes James's absence had carved, weren't unfillable. Not entirely. The twins squealed, tugging at his sleeves and demanding attention. Peter followed them to the living room, where scattered toys and half-drawn pictures painted a chaotic story of loss and resilience. He sank onto the rug, letting the children crawl over him, their laughter fragile but insistent, and felt a tug at his chest. It was the same tug he'd felt since he arrived in Telluride, that constant ache of being both needed and unneeded at the same time. He wanted to help, to fix what couldn't be fixed, but grief wasn't something you patched together with good intentions. It had a shape, a jagged, cruel shape, and he was only beginning to understand its contours. Ella joined them, kneeling beside the twins and brushing hair from their faces. Peter noticed the subtle tremor in her hands, the quiet stiffness of her shoulders. He wanted to reach out, to ease that tension, but the distance between them was more than physical. It was built from years of independence, fear, and heartbreak too heavy to name. Do you want some help? He asked finally, careful not to push, careful to offer a hand without forcing it. She looked at him, really looked at him, and for a moment the world shrank to the living room floor, the scattered toys, and the three of them, caught in this fragile bubble of ordinary life. I don't need help, she said softly, and then, after a pause, almost to herself, but I'll take it anyway. That admission hung in the air between them, a fragile bridge over the emptiness James had left behind. Peter didn't cross it immediately. He waited, letting her take the first step, because he understood now that the shape of what was missing wasn't something you could force or fill, it had to be discovered, piece by piece, in moments like this. And in that quiet, messy living room, with laughter and tears tangled together, Peter realized he might just be the one to help her, not by replacing what was gone, but by learning how to stand in the spaces it had left behind. The twins clambered over him again, tugging him into their little world of play and chaos. Peter laughed, loud and genuine, and Ella's smile, small, tentative, and real, was the first crack of light he had seen in days. It wasn't everything. Nothing ever would be. But it was enough to begin. The morning sun poured through the frost-lined windows, catching the dust motes like tiny stars suspended in midair. Peter leaned against the doorframe, coffee mug in hand, watching Ella chase the twins across the living room, their giggles ricocheting off the walls. For a moment, it looked like any ordinary family morning, but nothing about this was ordinary. He felt it first in his chest, a strange, hollow twist, as if the sound of their laughter was a reminder of everything he hadn't saved. The room was alive with warmth, movement, and joy, and yet, in his ears, it sounded almost cruel. A betrayal of the silence that had followed James's death, of the grief that still weighed heavy in every corner. Ella's hair was loose today, sunlight catching the strands like fire, and she smiled as she swooped one of the twins into her arms. Her laugh rang out, rich and full, and Peter froze. He knew he should be happy, he wanted to be happy, but the sound tore at him. It was a reminder of everything he couldn't fix, of the promise he had made to James. He had come to protect her, to help her, and yet here she was, thriving despite her pain, while he remained a shadow on the edge of their lives. The twins squealed, tumbling over one another, and Peter finally set the coffee down, running a hand over his face. He wanted to step forward, to speak, to join in, but he couldn't. His own laughter felt impossible, inappropriate. And still, a part of him, a dangerous, tender part, wanted to cross that distance, to let himself feel, to let himself be drawn in by the life that pulsed stubbornly in this house. Ella glanced up, catching him at the doorway. Her eyes softened, but she didn't stop. She couldn't. Not for him, not yet. The twins clung to her skirts, laughing, and Peter felt that twist again, the one that made his chest ache and his throat tighten. It wasn't just grief that pinned him in place, it was the realization that he had been standing outside her world for too long, letting her move forward while he lingered in the shadows of promises, letters, and guilt. Her laughter wasn't betrayal, not really, but it felt like betrayal to a heart weighed down by survival and the invisible presence of a friend he had failed to save. And yet, beneath the ache, beneath the guilt, something fragile stirred. A spark of hope, of longing, that maybe he didn't have to live in the shadows forever. Maybe, if he could survive the fear and the grief, he could step into the warmth that had been there all along, laughter and chaos, heartbreak and love, waiting for him in equal measure. Peter inhaled deeply, letting the scent of pancakes and baby shampoo fill his lungs. He forced a small smile, almost imperceptible, and finally, almost painfully, he moved forward. Not to interrupt, not to intrude, but to exist in their world, to be part of it. And maybe, someday, to laugh with them instead of feeling betrayed by the sound. Peter stood at the edge of the frozen lake, the wind biting through his jacket, tugging at his scarf like it wanted to pull him away from everything he was trying to hold together. Ella's laughter, soft, half-hearted, like she was trying not to break, echoed behind him as the twins skidded across the ice, their small hands clutched tightly around each other. He wanted to tell her. He wanted to say the words that had been tangled in his chest for months, words that had nothing to do with duty or promises, and everything to do with the way his heart refused to be quiet when she was near. Peter drove through the winding mountain roads, the tires crunching over the thin layer of snow that clung stubbornly to the edges. Telluride had changed since he'd left. Had the world changed, or had he? The answer was somewhere between the frozen peaks and the ache in his chest. He pulled up to the familiar cabin, the one Ella had insisted on keeping just as their parents had left it. Smoke curled lazily from the chimney, a small comfort against the sharp winter air. Two little figures ran to the door, their faces lighting up at the sight of him. The twins. Their laughter was the same as James's, bright, unfiltered, and heartbreakingly innocent. Ella opened the door before he could knock. Her arms were crossed, jaw tight, but her eyes betrayed her fatigue. The weight of months, maybe years, pressed down on her small frame. Peter wanted to reach out, to bridge the distance between them, but he hesitated, remembering the promise he'd made, not to Ella alone, but to James. "Peter," she said, voice low, guarded. "You didn't have to come back." "I promised him," he said quietly. The words felt heavier than the snow-laden clouds above. "I promised James I'd come back." Her eyes softened, just a fraction, but the walls were still there. She stepped aside, letting him in, but her stance said she was ready to retreat the moment he faltered. Peter noticed everything, the way she flinched at sudden sounds, how her gaze lingered on objects that reminded her of loss, how she carried the weight of two children and a grief too large for anyone to shoulder alone. He knelt for the twins, lifting them into his arms. "Missed you," he murmured, and they hugged him like he was part of their world all along, not a stranger returned from the dead edges of memory. The warmth of their small bodies stirred something in him, something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in months. Dinner was silent, punctuated only by the clatter of cutlery and the occasional sigh from Ella. Peter studied her across the table, tracing the lines of tension etched into her face. She had changed, too. Stronger, yes, but fragile in ways she refused to admit. The grief had shaped her, hardened her, but also made her more luminous in the quiet moments. Later, when the children were asleep, Peter found Ella in the living room, curled up with a blanket around her shoulders. She looked smaller in the dim light, yet unyielding. He took a deep breath, feeling the years of distance, fear, and unspoken words compress into a single moment. "I'm not here just because of a promise," he said softly, sitting across from her. "I'm here because I can't not be." Ella nodded slowly, letting a single tear escape. Peter reached for her hand, tentative, unsure, but unwavering in his choice. And in that small touch, the first real step toward healing began. Because that was the truth the dead asked of the living, to keep loving, even when the world demanded you stop. And Peter, at last, understood. Peter drove through the winding mountain roads, the tires crunching over the thin layer of snow that clung stubbornly to the edges. Telluride had changed since he'd left. Had the world changed, or had he? The answer was somewhere between the frozen peaks and the ache in his chest. He pulled up to the familiar cabin, the one Ella had insisted on keeping just as their parents had left it. Smoke curled lazily from the chimney, a small comfort against the sharp winter air. Two little figures ran to the door, their faces lighting up at the sight of him. The twins. Their laughter was the same as James's, bright, unfiltered, and heartbreakingly innocent. Ella opened the door before he could knock. Her arms were crossed, jaw tight, but her eyes betrayed her fatigue. The weight of months, maybe years, pressed down on her small frame. Peter wanted to reach out, to bridge the distance between them, but he hesitated, remembering the promise he'd made, not to Ella alone, but to James. "Peter," she said, voice low, guarded. "You didn't have to come back." "I promised him," he said quietly. The words felt heavier than the snow-laden clouds above. "I promised James I'd come back." Her eyes softened, just a fraction, but the walls were still there. She stepped aside, letting him in, but her stance said she was ready to retreat the moment he faltered. Peter noticed everything, the way she flinched at sudden sounds, how her gaze lingered on objects that reminded her of loss, how she carried the weight of two children and a grief too large for anyone to shoulder alone. He knelt for the twins, lifting them into his arms. "Missed you," he murmured, and they hugged him like he was part of their world all along, not a stranger returned from the dead edges of memory. The warmth of their small bodies stirred something in him, something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in months. Dinner was silent, punctuated only by the clatter of cutlery and the occasional sigh from Ella. Peter studied her across the table, tracing the lines of tension etched into her face. She had changed, too. Stronger, yes, but fragile in ways she refused to admit. The grief had shaped her, hardened her, but also made her more luminous in the quiet moments. Later, when the children were asleep, Peter found Ella in the living room, curled up with a blanket around her shoulders. She looked smaller in the dim light, yet unyielding. He took a deep breath, feeling the years of distance, fear, and unspoken words compress into a single moment. "I'm not here just because of a promise," he said softly, sitting across from her. "I'm here because I can't not be." She looked at him then, really looked, and something shifted. The walls wavered. Peter didn't push. He simply stayed, offering the presence he hadn't been able to before, letting the silence speak the words they both feared to say. And in that quiet, Peter realized that coming back had changed him, not because of guilt or duty, but because he understood now that love required risk, presence, and the courage to face the unspoken. For the first time since James's death, he felt like he was exactly where he was meant to be. The morning air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of pine and snow from the mountains beyond the valley. Peter stood in the doorway, watching the twins chase each other through the small yard, their laughter bouncing off the wooden siding of the house. Ella was inside, humming softly while preparing breakfast, and for a moment, the world felt suspended, fragile and perfect all at once. He leaned against the frame, arms crossed, and allowed himself a slow exhale. This chaotic, messy, beautiful life was not what he had ever imagined. Not for himself, not for her, and certainly not for anyone who carried the weight of grief the way she did. But somehow, it was theirs now. "You're staring again," Ella's voice said behind him, teasing but warm. He turned to see her wiping her hands on a kitchen towel, eyes bright despite the dark circles beneath them. "Can't help it," he admitted, a small smile tugging at his lips. "They are happy. And you," his voice faltered. "You're managing all of this. It's impressive." She shrugged, but there was no denying the vulnerability in her expression. "I don't feel impressive. I feel tired. Tired and scared that I'm going to mess it up." "Mess them up?" Peter stepped closer, placing a hand gently on her shoulder. "You're not going to mess anything up. You're doing the impossible. You're keeping them safe. You're keeping all of us alive." Ella's eyes glistened, but she shook her head. "I didn't plan this life. I didn't plan to be raising twins alone. I didn't plan to lose James or Mom or Dad. And I definitely didn't plan," her voice cracked, "for you to be here." He caught her hand before she could pull it away, holding it like it was the only solid thing in the world. "Maybe none of this was planned," he said softly, "but maybe some things are meant to be. Me being here, it's not about planning. It's about choice. And I choose this, us, all of it." For a long moment, she stared at him, searching his face as though trying to reconcile the quiet strength in his eyes with the chaos swirling in her heart. Then, slowly, she allowed herself to relax, leaning into his hand, letting the tension in her shoulders dissolve. The twins burst into the kitchen, cheeks flushed with cold, carrying a handful of pine cones each as if they were treasures. "Look, Aunt Ella. Look, Peter," they shouted in unison, barely giving him time to kneel and scoop them up. Their giggles filled the room, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Peter allowed himself to imagine a life where this noise, this mess, this love, was enough. Ella watched him with a tenderness he had rarely seen, and for a fleeting second, the grief that had shadowed their days seemed less like a weight, and more like a reminder, that love could grow in the spaces left behind by loss. "I don't know how this happened," she whispered, almost to herself. He smiled, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Neither do I. But maybe that's the point. We didn't plan it. But sometimes, the best families are the ones we never planned for." And in that small kitchen, with pine-scented air and tiny hands gripping his, Peter finally understood. These twins, this woman, this unexpected family, was worth every heartbreak, every sleepless night, every unspoken fear. This family they hadn't planned for was exactly the one they needed. He held her close, feeling her heartbeat match his own, and for the first time, he didn't feel like a replacement. He felt like home. Outside, the snow began to fall gently, dusting the world in white. Peter stood in the doorway of Ella's kitchen, the cold light of early morning slipping in around him, painting the wooden floors silver. She hadn't asked him to stay. She hadn't even looked at him like she wanted him there. And yet, he couldn't leave, not after everything, not after James's last letter had made him promise. Ella was at the counter, cradling a mug of coffee as if it were a lifeline. The twins slept upstairs, the soft rhythm of their breathing echoing through the house. Her shoulders were tense, her jaw tight, and even from across the room, Peter could feel the weight she carried. The grief, the exhaustion, the fight to keep everything together, it all radiated from her like heat from a furnace. I made pancakes," he said, his voice awkward, fumbling. He hated how small his words felt, how inadequate they sounded against the enormity of what she was facing. Ella glanced up, her eyes wary, the faintest trace of a smile flickering before she wiped it away. "You didn't have to," she said, though her voice cracked at the edges. "I know. But I want to," he replied, stepping closer. Each movement was deliberate, careful not to startle her, not to break whatever fragile wall she had built around herself. "I'm not leaving. Not unless you tell me to." Her fingers trembled slightly around the mug. "Peter," she began, her voice soft, almost lost. "You shouldn't be here. You've got your own life." "And I chose this one," he interrupted gently. "I chose to be here. For them. For you. For him." His eyes glistened, holding hers as if trying to anchor her to something real, something steady. "I promised him, and I don't break promises. Not anymore." She looked away, swallowing hard, fighting against the surge of emotion she had been suppressing for months. She wanted to tell him no, wanted to push him out, because letting anyone in felt like admitting she couldn't handle it alone. But when she glanced back at him, she saw something in Peter that she hadn't allowed herself to see in a long time, unwavering, quiet devotion. The moment stretched, the silence thick but not heavy. Peter crossed the room, setting the mug of coffee down beside her and leaning against the counter. Close enough to offer comfort, far enough not to crowd. He didn't touch her, yet, but his presence was a lifeline, steady and patient. "You don't have to say it," he said softly. "You don't have to thank me or apologize. I'm staying." Without being asked. Ella's defenses wavered, and a single tear slipped down her cheek. She blinked it away, shaking her head, trying to regain composure, but the truth settled in her chest like a weight she had carried alone for far too long. "Okay," she whispered finally, her voice barely audible. "Okay, then stay." Peter nodded, a small, quiet smile tugging at his lips. He didn't need more. Staying wasn't just a promise, it was a choice he made every day, silently, for her, for the twins, for the memory of a friend who had trusted him to do what he could not. Outside, the first rays of sunlight crept over the mountains, brushing the house in warm gold. Inside, the kitchen smelled faintly of coffee and pancakes, and for the first time in months, the air felt lighter, fragile, but unbroken. Peter stayed. Without being asked. And somehow, that made all the difference.